Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video on YouTube to help you improve your chess game. I thought we'd talk today a little bit about principles and principles versus priorities versus what state you're in. Just using principles, deciding about principles. So there's a couple things you need to know about principles. First of all, knowing a lot of them is very helpful, and actually following them is very helpful. One of the biggest problems I see in my students is they know principles, they know they should apply them, but they have what we would call a better idea. They get into a position and they say, all right, I know my rooks belong on an open file, and I haven't developed my rooks yet, and I have another principle that says move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. But rather than putting my rook on an open file, I'll move my knight again and try to make my knight a little better, which also violates yet another principle, which is it's much better usually to take a piece that's doing nothing and have it do something than it is to take a piece that's doing something and have it do a little more. So they're violating all kinds of principles, but they have a better idea. All right, so what do we need to know to start talking about principles? The first thing we need to know about principles is principles don't apply in two situations. The first situation is if you have a book move. So, for instance, let's say in the opening the book says that you should move a knight twice. All right, well, if you know that's the book move and that's what you studied and you're 100% sure you're in the exact same position that you were in the position that you studied, it's not similar, it's just exactly the same. You say, all right, in this opening, on the sixth move, my knight goes here, and that's moving my knight twice, but that's the book move. Okay, you don't need a principle. So if it's a book move, let's say to move the knight twice, and the principle is move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic, then you're not breaking principle to move the knight twice. You're simply playing a book move. If you know what to do, then you don't use principles. Principles are things that you use to help you when you're not quite sure what to do. That leads us to the second time you don't use principles, which is when you're in an analytical position and your analysis tells you what the best move is, then principles don't apply. If your analysis tells you what the best move is, it could break 67 principles, but if you can prove it's the best move, it doesn't matter. That's the move you play. I remember talking about this with Danny Benjamin when Dan was a young guy, and we were talking about principles, and I said, Dan, if you see a move where it wins, or you see a move where it's clearly the best move, then you don't care about how many principles it violates, you just play it. All right, so I picked out a position here from Vachier-Lagrave against Spindler at the Sinquefield Cup in recent months, where we could look at what principles might apply in the position, but we can also figure out whether analysis can overcome the principles. So in a position like this, what were some principles that might apply? Well, one principle could be in endgames, a queen and a knight is better than a queen and a bishop. So that would kind of tell us, all right, it's probably better to have black's position than white's. What's another principle? Another principle would be something like when your king has back rank issues, make luft for your king. So that would tell you that if it's black's move here, he might be thinking of making a move like f6 to give his king the f7 square. Another principle would be, double pawns are weak. And we could say, all right, well, white has double pawns on the f file and black doesn't have any double pawns, so that's bad for white. Or we could say passed pawns are good. Well, black has a passed pawn on the c4 square, and not only is it a passed pawn, but the white queen is not in a great position to stop it, and the black queen's in pretty good position to help it down the board, and the white king can't stop it. So that pawn looks pretty dangerous. So it looks like black's got another advantage there. So we could keep applying all these principles, but they really don't mean much. The first thing that really means something here is it's white's move. And since it's white's move, if he can do something really good with that move, we don't really care about the principles. So now we have to rely on analysis. And I don't want to do a lot of analysis here because we have lots of videos in our Dan Heisman chess video channel here that are on analysis, but we want to see if the analysis can overcome anything that we might know about principles. Well, the key thing in the analysis here is not only does black have a weak back rank, but he also has weak dark squares around the king. And one of the weak dark squares around the king, which may not be as noticeable, is e7. e7 isn't really a weak square. You can't have a weak square on the 7th or 8th rank because those squares can never be guarded by pawns anyway. But there's a pawn on e7, and it's not guarded. And if white can get that pawn on e7 without giving up the pressure on the back rank, then he might be able to penetrate on the dark squares and get in. But how would white be able to do that? Well, the analysis would show that white has some good ideas here. He can get in on the dark squares and threaten the knight because the queen is tied down to the knight. So let's look at the move that Vachier-Lagrave played. He played bishop to b2. Well, at first that looks like a crazy move. The queen can just take it. But of course the queen can't take it because the queen takes e8 mate. So what can black do? Well, that's a problem. He'd like to get out of the pin. If he pushes the pawn, white can just take it. That doesn't do much. Can the queen keep guarding the knight? Well, the queen can keep guarding the knight, but he doesn't have anything that he can do positive when he's doing that. For instance, let's say he plays queen to a4 to keep guarding the knight. All right, well, white could then go after these squares and play bishop a3, same kind of thing as before. Notice how these pawns form a wall that the black queen can't get to it. And now white's simply threatening to play something like queen takes e7, queen f8 mate. And that's very difficult to stop. Black can't guard the pawn with the queen because the queen has to guard the knight. He can't take the bishop, queen takes a3 because of queen e8 mate. He can't play king f8 because queen takes c7 check. And moving the e-pawn really doesn't help him much because after queen e7, queen f8 mate is a threat. So white's threatening, strangely enough, to do all this kind of stuff on the dark squares, but not necessarily just along diagonal. If black plays f6, white could just take the pawn here, but rather than giving up the pin, it's probably better just to play bishop to a3. Let's ask the engine. Mr. Stockfish, what do you play here? Stockfish says, yeah, Dan, but queen takes e7 is mate. Bishop a3 is also mate. Once you take the pawn here, the knight can't move because you've got mates on g7. You're threatening bishop takes f6 and then some mates anyway, or bishop a3. And Stockfish says you've got a mating attack. What if he plays king to f8? Well, this is where we've got that bishop a3 again. But now the king's guarding the knight, so the queen is free to move and guard the e-pawn. So let's say the queen goes back and to b7 and guards the pawn. Well, now white needs to break him up. He can play the break move d6. And now the knight can't take, it's illegal. Pawn takes pawn check. Winning the knight is the threat. And the knight can't move. The pawn can't move because white has discovered check hitting the knight, and then it's going to be mate on the next move. So, to Svidler's credit, and to Vachier-Lagrave's credit, Vachier-Lagrave, the computer says both e5 and bishop b2 will mate. Vachier-Lagrave plays bishop b2, a move that, lower rated players may not even think of. It looks kind of like, what? And Svidler thought on this position, and then he resigned because he realized that he couldn't take the bishop, and bishop a3 is a threat that he really can't stop. So all those principles we talked about at the start just don't apply. Let's go to the next game and see what we can find there. All right, so we're going to go examine Sinquefield 21% 11. All right, we're looking for principles. We got Wesley So against Svidler. All right, so again, one of the things I just said earlier is principles don't apply to book moves. Well, obviously grandmasters know a lot of book moves. English opening, g6 offering either a Grunfeld or a King's Indian. Knight c3, keeping his options open. c5, now we've got something defined. We've got what's called the symmetric English. All right, so white has several ways of playing against this. He can fianchetto and go after the white squares. He can play knight f3 and d4 and break. He can play e3 and d4. Those are the three main ways of playing the opening. Let's see which one So chooses. He chooses the fianchetto variation. Bishop there, knight c6. And now white has a choice again. He can play knight f3 and go for a d4 break. He can play like a Botvinnik system and play e4. He can play e3 and then go for d4. He could even play something like rook b1 and go for a3 and b4 break. You got to break with d4 or b4 sometime in the opening. Knight f3, e5. Now black might set up a Botvinnik system with knight ge7 and castle and d6. White plays a3, going for that b4 break. This is all bookied, but both sides are playing slow because there's so many transpositions here. a5, trying to stop, black's trying to stop both breaks. You can't always do that, but you can hold them up for a while. d3, knight ge7, black's definitely going for a Botvinnik setup. Knight d2, he has some flexibility here on whether he wants to, he's just trying to stop the d5 break, but he could also bring the knight up to e4. d6, again setting up, this is called the Botvinnik system, where you play the pawns here, you play the knight here, you fianchetto the bishop, and you castle kingside. Knight there, now he's going to put both knights on the square so that only one can be taken off. Castle, knight e3. So white has now moved this knight 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Does that break opening principle? Yes, it does. Move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Now, was this a book line? Well, it's a book idea, but it's not a book line. Look at Grandmaster So's time. He started with 90 minutes with a 30-second increment, and he has used almost 20 minutes. If these were book moves, he would have moved much, much faster. So since they're not book moves, he is purposely violating the principle, but he's a grandmaster and he knows what he can get away with. And he knows he's going to try to fight to win this d5 square here with these moves. Black's, of course, is going to try to play against that by getting some space. He plays rook b8, which in some of these lines where the knights go up to d5, he'll counter by undermining it with b5. Rook b1. Again, getting ready for a break on b4. Knight d4. Again, moving a piece twice in the opening. Has he moved every piece once? No, he certainly hasn't. So he brings the knight up there. You know, again, if you're a grandmaster, you know what you can get away with. That's a lot different. He really doesn't care about that principle, don't move pieces twice. He wants to make sure all his pieces are good. Well, the f8 rook can probably develop with the expansion of f5. The bishop's a very fast piece. He can go all the way across the board. The queen doesn't have anywhere to go right at the moment. So he says, I can break principle. No problem. I'm not worried. White develops a bishop. He's putting off castling a little bit. So one of the principles here is castle early and often. Well, Grandmaster So could have castled on this move. And I'm sure castles is one of his better moves. But he actually takes another 5 minutes and doesn't. He develops the bishop instead. Let's look at what Stockfish says. If you're not sure in a position like this, you should probably follow principle and castle. I always tell my students, if castling is possible and it's safe, and there's no danger, and you could castle or you could move another piece, castling's always going to be one of the best moves, but whatever else you choose might or might not be one of the best. So in those kind of positions, it's best to just castle. So Stockfish, am I lying here? Is castles one of the best? And the answer is sure it is. It's right up there. So, you know, if you're not sure here, just castle. Now, Grandmaster So understands that bishop d2 and castling are very close, and he could even break with b4. Those are the top 3 moves. Right now, upon looking a little deeper, Stockfish 14 thinks castling is just slightly worse than Grandmaster So's move of bishop d2. So credit for Grandmaster So for perceiving the difference. Right now the difference is only 0.16. But he thinks bishop d2 is the more accurate move order, and it is. But if you're not sure what to do, I would follow principle here and castle. This is a good use of comparing principles, using principles. You know, you want to move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Well, bishop d2 doesn't violate that. But castle early and often, when in doubt, castle. That's the principle that would apply. And it would not lead you wrong here. It might not be the 100% best move, but you wouldn't be going wrong by castling. All right, so bishop d2, bishop d7, and there's our buddy castle. Now both sides have to figure out what they want to do with their queen and their king bishop. Black says, let's neutralize the long diagonal. White says, while you're doing that, I'll get in my break move with b4. Notice White's all the way down to 35 minutes. One of the principles you can use is called Botvinnik's rule, which is when you're playing a game, you want to use roughly 20% of your time for your first 15 moves. Well, 20% of your time is a little hard to calculate when there's a big increment. If this was a 90-0 game, then calculating 20% of your time would be trivial. It would be 18 minutes to 20% of 90. But when there's a big increment, the math is a little bit harder. Instead of 4th grade math, it's like 6th grade math. So the actual 20% would be higher than 72 minutes. It would be more like maybe 75 or 76 minutes, something like that. And Wesley So has used like 3 times that amount of time. He's all the way down to 35 minutes. Can he get away with it? Is he able to play fairly quickly and fairly well later? Yes, he does, and he's depending on that. You know, I tell my students, unless you're a really, really good player, you don't want to unnecessarily run your clock down like this. But good players know what they're getting into, and, you know, if I said to Grandmaster So, you should probably play a little faster in this game, he'd probably look at me and say, who are you? Or if he did know me, he'd say, Dan, you're right. I probably should have played it a little bit faster. Maybe next time I will when I know it a little better. But I really needed the time here. Okay, so pawn takes, pawn takes. Oh, now we see So's clock goes up 10 minutes. So this is a relay issue. He really didn't take that much time. When they relayed the game to the ICC here, he actually had about 10 more minutes. But he's still playing pretty slowly. Pawn takes, rook takes. All right, so what kind of principles here? Well, we still need to finish our development. We still have a bunch of pieces doing nothing. Let's see if Black does something about it. First he trades off. There he goes. He gets the queen into the game and clears the way for the rook. So now Black has to decide, do I want to push the pawn to f5 and maybe f4 and get in the game that way? Or do I want the rook to come into the game some other way? All right, White has the same issues here. He plays knight d5. He says, I know I put both knights on that square for some reason. Now if you trade off my knights, I can take with another knight. And if you don't, I can take your knight and then stick my knight in there. One way or another, I'll be okay. Black says, you're right. Therefore, I'll just leave you with redundant knights. Larry Kaufman calls these redundant knights. And I'll take my own redundant knights. White says, okay, got to save the rook. Black says, all right, I found a way to activate this rook. I'll activate it by pushing the pawn in front of it. White could actually do the same thing. He could play his pawn up to activate his rook. And he does, but he only pushes it up 1. He has some we're talking about principles. One principle is, a lot of my students quote to me, don't push a lot of pawns in front of your king. You know, they read Chernev's logical chess move by move, where Chernev makes a big deal about that. And right now, both sides have pushed 2 of the 3 pawns in front of their king. Actually, it's quite safe. Chernev goes a little overboard when he does that. I wrote an article about this called Nunn, Chernev, and Learning Chess, where I talked about Grandmaster Nunn, who was, you know, he was translating the book from descriptive into algebraic, that book Logical Chess Move by Move, and he found several things that Chernev said that he thought were not only just misleading, but actually outright incorrect. And he wanted to correct the book, but instead he wrote an article about why he didn't correct the book, and he said, I'm never doing this again, because I think he thought it was a little incorrect and frustrating to do this. So anyway, don't move up the pawns in front of your king. A principle, both sides, Black's using his pawns to get space. White needs to counter that space a little bit. Don't weaken the dark squares. Well, White has a dark square bishop that's right in the area to guard that weakened d3 square. Black plays rook f7, maybe overprotecting the b pawn and getting ready to double rooks and push the pawn some more. White plays bishop e3. I guess he's going to trade off the redundant knight. I'm not sure. Black says, oh, you told me not to push any pawns in front of my king? I'm going to push all my pawns in front of my king. Is Black's king in any danger here? Of course not. Look at the pawns here. It looks like a little dragon, just like in the dragon opening. What's behind those pawns? Well, it's all black pieces. What does that mean? Well, it means Black's controlling all the squares around his king. Sure, the knight has access to a couple squares, and the bishop has access to a square, but not nearly enough. So unless Black plays terrible here, his king's fine. All right, White plays queen d2, creating a little battery here where he can try to fight for Black against Black playing maybe f4 or get the bishop up to g5. Black says, I think I will fight myself for those squares. I'll bring the knight back there. I can always bring the other knight up. White says, okay, rooks belong on open and semi-open files. Which one do I want? Do I want the open file? Well, there's not much action there. How about on the semi-open file? Well, I've got an isolated pawn. He's got it well guarded, but I can tie down all his pieces and keep that pawn almost like a backward pawn where it can't move. It's not a backward pawn right now, but it's almost like a backward pawn, and it's isolated. Black says, yeah, but I have more space on the rest of the board. Black brings the king up to try to hold that h6 square. That way White can never play bishop h6. Notice Black's last couple moves, knight e6, king h7, have been meant to kind of blunt the power on this diagonal. Again, they're doing a lot of analysis, but they're doing principles and analysis. As we saw in the last example, where Vachier-Lagrave played bishop to b2, that was 100% analysis and no principles. What we're seeing here is a lot of analysis, but also some principles involved too. So White plays h4, again, going against the principle, don't push the pawns up in front of your king, but it makes the g-pawn backward. It counters Black's ability to guard some of these squares. So, and is the king perfectly safe here? Yes, he is. Is it possible much later he could get into trouble if White doesn't play well and Black gets his pieces in there? It's possible, but I don't think Grandmaster So is too worried about that. Black says, yes, there's that move. I can wait now. White's got 1, 2, 3, 4 on it. Black only has 1, 2, 3, but at the end, does the bishop hit the knight? No, because the knight's guarded by the other knight. So maybe he's even just sacrificing the pawn to break open the king. All right, White says, I'll take it. If I don't, you're going to take me anyway. Black takes back. White says, nah, I'll just guard the pawn. I'm not going to take the pawn. All right, so that took some calculation, but Grandmaster So did it pretty quickly. In fact, the relay shows he actually gained time. Knight d4. Black says, I'm coming back in. White says, I'll take it. Now White's a little bit weak on these dark squares around the king. If Black has a dark squared bishop, if Black can get in and get the queen in there somehow, maybe queen back to d8 or whatever, then good things can happen. White's got some good knights, of course, and he says, you've got the dark squares, I've got my knights locked into the white squares. I can pop in there. And in this position, Black resigns. Wow. So let's take a look at why. Well, Black was threatening to take the rook, and White says, you could take the rook. I'm going to play there. All right, so is White threatening knight f6 winning the queen? No, the bishop's on it. He can't play bishop takes rook, because then knight checks does win the queen, because even if rook takes, knight takes, he's winning the queen. So we realize he can't take the rook. But just because he can't take the rook, why is he resigning? Well, White's not threatening rook takes b7. He doesn't seem to be threatening knight to g5. So we've got to look a little bit deeper here. Can White get rid of the bishop so that knight f6 does become a threat? I don't see it. So let's kind of ask what happens if Black does nothing here. Let's say he moves the king out of the forking square. Let's say he plays a move like king to h8. What would White do? Well, before we turn on the engine, let's see if we can figure it out ourselves. Is bishop takes b6 now a threat? Possibly. But let's see what White can do. Can White play rook takes d6? He certainly can. That's the problem. The d6 square is, and once the d6 square falls, everything's going to fall. All right, so let's go back. So black needs to save the d6 square. Clearly he can't save it with bishop this way because he loses the queen. So let's say he moves the bishop this way. But now white could play, well, can he play d4? I'm checking to see if he can. d4, knight takes, queen takes, bishop takes. He can't. All right. So bishop e5. That's a good candidate move. What could white play? Now that we can't play, can we play c5? No. Can we play knight g5 check followed by something? No. So let's see. What would be what? If black resigned, he must have looked at this move bishop e5 and said, white has an unstoppable threat. I know c5 is tempting, but I really don't think that's the right move. He could hit the d pawn again with queen to b4, also putting pressure on b7. I guess queen to b4 is a good move. Is it enough to make black resign? He can't play rook d8 because the rook takes b7. The threat is knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, winning. So I guess queen b4 is good. Is that enough to make him resign? Well, let's see here. Let's go back and we'll ask the engine. Mr. Engine. Again, this is not going to be principles at all. This is 100% analysis. What can black do? Stockfish says, if rook to d8, then you sack the rook for the queen and the pawns. Rook takes, and then just win this pawn. Knight takes f4, and black is down the 2 pawns. White has a queen and 2 pawns versus the rook. All right, so that he can't do. So, but what about the bishop e5 move? Bishop e5, Stockfish says, oh, you overwork the bishop. You take rook takes, and if the bishop takes, then you play knight checks and you win the queen. So bishop e5 is an overworked piece. Shame on you, Dan, for not seeing that right away. So that really doesn't guard it. So therefore, that's not a move, and he doesn't have any really good moves to guard against rook takes d6. And that's why Grandmaster Fiddler resigned here. Okay, so analysis versus principles. Analysis always takes precedence. You know, if you see the best move, you play it. If you're you want to learn how to analyze. A lot of people that have started with me with students don't know how to analyze at all. They play the entire game by hand waving. They do every move by principle, and they really don't know what analysis. I mean, they kind of know what analysis is, but you know, they really don't know how to do it. Even people who play slow sometimes don't analyze. They do lots and lots and lots of hand waving. All right, well, my analysis should certainly have shown my checks, captures, and threats. It's funny, I saw the bishop couldn't, you know, be deflected. I said he can't play bishop c5 because of knight here. I should have used the same logic and said, oh, well, if he plays bishop e5, he's not really guarding the pawn because he can't go off the diagonal. Same logic. All right, so you want to learn how to analyze, and you want to learn principles, but you can't apply the same principles in the same positions. For instance, if you're in an endgame, you have different principles than you are in the middle game or opening. You can't use middle game principles a lot of times in the endgame. So principles change depending on the state of the game. If you have a very locked up closed position, then there's certain principles that handle locked up closed positions. If you have a position where you castle opposite sides and the queens are on the board, then a lot of times the principles that apply in same side castling don't apply as much, because it's whoever gets there first throws the kitchen sink at the opponent is probably the one who's winning, and that's the #1 principle, and all the other principles are much, much less important. In fact, when you're castle opposite sides with queens on the board, you might even be down a small amount of material, but if your attack gets in there first, then it doesn't matter as much. So you've got all these things about principles. Well, we could talk all day about principles. They write an entire book about principles. That's not the purpose of the video. The purpose of the video is to make people aware. Analysis versus principles. How do you compare principles? For instance, a principle that applies to whether or not you can win the game would usually take precedence, or almost always take precedence, over a principle that's just about a nicety. You know, so if you at the end of the game, if you need some pawns left to get a queen so you can win the game, then the most important principle there might be don't unnecessarily trade pawns, because you're going to need pawns to create queens at the end of the game to have promotion so that you'll be able to mate the other player. If you trade off those pawns, no matter what other principles are telling you about trading or not trading, then you can't win the game. Now, obviously, if you're trying to draw instead of win, that's a whole different ballgame. But that's what I'm saying. The principles are quite different depending on what the situations are. So you have different states of the game: opening, middle game, end game, locked position, complicated positions, open positions, and they have different principles that might apply. For instance, you have a principle that says if you're in a closed position, try to keep as many of your pieces as you can behind your pawns. Once you start trading off a bunch of pawns, the position becomes more open, then keeping your pieces behind your pawns doesn't matter. For instance, in this position, there's been a bunch of pawns traded. The knights are very nicely placed in front of white's pawns. The rooks, of course, are not involved on the B file where there's any pawns at all. Black's pieces are pretty much behind his pawns, but black has some key weaknesses that the knight and the rooks are taken care of. All right, we'll go back to the final position here just to show you. This is where Grandmaster Fiddler resigned, just when he was about to take off the rook, too. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Please pass the word about the channel, and we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.